In a 15th century English garden, somebody is planting pepper, not the vine. Pepper does not grow in England and never has. What is going into that bed is a low white-flowered plant called dittander. The household will grind its root and use it the way you use black pepper, because real pepper costs more than a labourer earns in a week. That plant is gone now, so are 14 others standing in the same garden. Not rare, not unfashionable. Gone from the shops, gone from the seed racks, gone out of the language. And no better vegetable pushed them out. Almost none of the 15 lost to another plant at all. Today we walk one medieval garden, bed by bed. 15 vegetables that fed Europe for centuries and then went missing, the job each one held, and the thing that actually took that job away. Start with what the garden was for, because it was not for feeding anybody. The calories came from grain, bread, and the pot of boiled grain that sat over the fire most days of the year. That is where a household got the energy to get through a day of work, and no bed of greens was ever going to compete with it. The garden was a separate department with a separate job, and the job was making that grain possible to eat every day for a lifetime without giving up. Which is why a medieval garden had no line running through it between herbs and vegetables. That split is a retail category, invented later by people selling in different aisles at different prices. A medieval gardener grew worts and pot herbs, and a plant earned its bed by what it did to the pot, not by whether you could put it on a plate by itself. Look at the surviving garden lists and the shape is obvious. Monastic plans, household books, the long rhyming lists of plants a good garden should hold. They do not separate seasoning from food or food from medicine. They run straight through all three, because to the person holding the spade, all three were the same question. What does this bed have to produce so that the pot works? Once you see the garden that way, the disappearances stop being a mystery. Every plant here is a solution to a specific problem in a specific pot. Take the problem away, and the solution has nothing left to do. 14 of the 15 are answers to a problem like that. The 15th, a thistle called cardoon, is not, and that is where this ends up. People are still making this by hand today. If you want to cook and keep food the way they did, the medieval larder is at the medieval waste store. 12 preservation methods, 24 recipes, no fridge needed. I will not mention it again. Which brings us to the first problem, and it is the oldest one in Northern Europe. Boiled grain is dull. A person eating it twice a day for 40 years stops being able to face it. The pot needs an edge. Something sharp enough to make the same dish read as a different dish twice in 1 week. Real spice existed and arrived by ship, and it cost what a shipped luxury costs, which put it beyond everyone in this story. The garden grew its own instead. Number 1. Dittander. Lepidium latifolium, the pepperwort, a tough perennial of damp ground with a root that is genuinely hot, sharp in the mouth in the same register as horseradish, and the English name is a plain statement of what it was for. Grated into a pot or onto saltfish in Lent, dittander seasoned the food of a household that would never once buy a peppercorn. It also tells you something about how these plants were valued, because dittander is a nuisance to keep. It spreads by root, it takes over a bed, and it is difficult to remove once established. A household put up with that. It put up with it for centuries, because the alternative was a spice ship. Number 2. Rocambole. The sand leek, Allium scorodoprosum, which sits between garlic and onion and behaves like neither. It sends up a stem that coils itself into a loop and carries a head of small purple bulbils at the top, and those bulbils are the part people used. Milder than garlic, easier to hold through a winter than an onion, and it came back every year without being replanted. For a cottage garden that nobody had time to manage, a plant that reappears on its own is worth more than a plant that tastes slightly better. Number 3. Cybole. Allium fistulosum, which modern seed catalogues call the Welsh onion, though it has nothing to do with Wales. It makes no proper bulb at all. It makes a standing clump of hollow green stems that survives a northern winter and can be cut in January. That is the whole point of it. A stored onion bulb by February is either sprouting or soft, and everybody knew it. Sybil was the answer to the specific weeks when the onion rope in the roof had failed and the new sowing was months away. 3 plants, 1 job. Sharpness the household never had to buy, but an edge on top of thin gruel is still thin gruel. The pot needed body, and body meant protein, and protein in the north meant one thing before it meant anything else. Number 4. The field pea, not the sweet green pea in a pod, which is a later plant bred for a different purpose entirely. The medieval pea was grown to be dried hard, poured into a sack, and boiled back into pottage months later. Brown, speckled, dun-coloured, and it survives in parts of northern England under the name Carlin peas, eaten one Sunday a year and almost nowhere else. This was the protein of an ordinary week for most people in Europe. Not meat, not fish. A dried pea that had been sitting in a sack since August. Number 5. The broad bean. Vicia faba was the bean of Europe, not one bean among several. The bean, for well over 1,000 years, dried and boiled and mashed and carried out to the fields as cold cakes by men who would be working until it got dark. Both of these are still technically buyable, and both have been pushed to the edge of the plate. That happened when the haricot bean came back from the Americas and did the same job with a thinner skin and a shorter cooking time. This is the single place on this list where a plant was honestly beaten by a better plant. Body and sharpness, and the pot is still short of the third thing. Green. Number 6. Colewort. Before cabbage was a ball, cabbage was a plant. Colewort is the open, loose-leaved kind that never hearts up at all, and the household did not harvest it. It picked from it. Outer leaves came off week after week from the same standing stem, which then produced more, and a good plant went on doing that for a couple of years. That is a completely different relationship from the one you have with a modern cabbage. A modern cabbage is an object. You buy it, you cut it, it is finished, you buy another. Colewort was a fixture in the ground that you visited, and this is the real reason the modern cabbage is a ball. A hearting cabbage is not better food than a colewort. It is better freight. It cuts once, it packs, it survives a cart and then a truck, and it arrives looking like the picture. The plant was bred for the journey, not for the pot, and the moment food started travelling, the loose-leaf kind had no case to make. Number 7. Leaf beet. The white beet, grown for the leaf, and the thick pale stalk, and not for any root at all. Medieval beets were not the round red thing in a jar. That came later, out of Renaissance Italy. What the garden held was a plant you could cut for greens through most of the year, with a midrib that cooked like a second vegetable inside the first, and it tolerated bad soil, drought and neglect better than anything else in the bed. In a garden that got attention on the days nobody was needed in the fields, that was not a small quality, which is fine from May to October, and useless in the months that actually decide whether a household comes through the year. Number 8. Bestort. Persicaria bistorta. The plant that solves February. Its leaves come up early in the worst stretch of the calendar when the stored roots have gone over and nothing sown that year has broken the surface yet. In northern England, it went into a pudding of leaves, oats and egg, and people are still making it, still around Easter, still under the local name Easter ledges. A vegetable that shows up in the Hungry Gap is worth more than a better vegetable that shows up in July, and every gardener on this list understood that ranking. Now the harder problem, and it explains more of this list than anything else. A medieval pot is not a pan. It hangs over a fire, and it works for hours at a time. Anything delicate that goes into it is destroyed by the time it comes out. So the garden had to grow aromatics built to survive a long boil and still be present at the end of it. Number 9. Smallage. Wild celery, Apium graveolens, before anybody thought to blanch it. Smallage is dark, tough, stringy, and aggressively bitter. Nobody was eating it raw off a plate, and nobody pretended otherwise. It went into the pot in small amounts as a seasoning, the way a bay leaf goes in, and in 1 hour it did what a stick of modern celery could not do in a day. Everything that makes celery pleasant to eat raw was bred into it later by blanching and selection, and every one of those improvements made it weaker in a pot. Number 10. Lovage. Levisticum officinale, which grows to 6 feet and needs 1 leaf to flavour an entire pot. It tastes like celery turned up to an unreasonable volume, with something dark and meaty sitting behind it. In a kitchen with no stock, no bouillon and meat 2 days a week, lovage is the plant that made a pot of vegetables taste as though there had been meat in it. That is a serious job. It is also a job that a factory took over completely, and the plant went with it. Number 11. Alicost, Tanacetum balsamita, and the English name is the receipt for its entire existence. Cost, from costus, an old word for a fragrant plant. Ale, because that is where it went. It turns out the biggest single extinction event in this garden had nothing to do with food at all. Medieval ale was brewed without hops. It was bittered and preserved with a mixture of herbs instead, and Alicost was one of the standard ones, grown for the brewing that happened in the same house as the cooking. Then hopped beer arrived from the Low Countries across the 15th century. Hops did the job better, kept the drink far longer, and turned brewing from a weekly household chore into a trade with its own buildings. An entire class of garden plants lost its employment inside about 2 generations, and not one of them lost it to a vegetable. They lost it to a different crop, grown on a different scale, in a different county, for a different industry. The same thing was about to happen at the other end of the pot, because a pot also needs sweetness, and sugar in this period is a medicine sold by the ounce. What the garden had instead were roots that turn sweet when they are cooked slowly. Number 12. Nayview. The long white turnip, Brassica rapa, thin and tapered rather than round, and sweeter than the globe turnip that displaced it. It grew fast enough to be sown after something else had come out. It sat in the ground until it was wanted, and it went into the pot to soften the whole thing from underneath. Number 13. Salsify, Tragopogon porifolius, a long pale root with a mild sweetness that writer after writer compared to oysters, which tells you more about how badly people wanted oysters than it does about the plant. Its real advantage was storage without a store. Salsify is biennial. It holds in the ground through frost without softening, and a household dug it as it wanted it from November onward, which meant one less thing in a cellar that was already full. It stood in every serious garden list in England, France, and the Low Countries for centuries. Try buying one this week. Number 14. Elecampane, Inula helenium, a huge yellow-flowered plant with a bitter aromatic root, and the medieval household did something with it that sounds strange until you remember the sugar problem. The root was boiled, drained, boiled again, and candied over days. That was a sweet and a cough remedy, and a stomach settler, and one bed was expected to supply all 3. That is the herb, food and medicine question again, and elecampane is the cleanest example of it on the list. Nobody who grew it could have told you which of the 3 it was, because the question would not have made sense. And then at the top of the garden, one plant that was not solving anything. Number 15. Cardoon, Cinara cardunculus, the thistle grown for its stalks instead of its bud, the same species that gave us the globe artichoke. You bank the stems up with earth to blanch them through autumn, then you strip them, boil them, and eat them. It is a great deal of work for one vegetable, and it takes up an enormous amount of room in a bed. Cardoon is the one plant here grown because somebody wanted it, rather than because a pot needed it. Every garden with any ambition kept a stand. It survives now in a handful of regions in Spain, in France, and in northern Italy, and effectively nowhere else, which is a strange fate for the only plant on this list that was ever a pleasure. So count the 15 and count what actually replaced them. Dittander, rocambole, and cibole lost to pepper and to shipping. Smallage lost to a blanched bread, milder celery sold by the stalk. Alicoste lost to hops. Elecampane, Naview, and salsify lost to cane sugar and to a seed trade that only printed what sold in volume. Colewort lost to the hearting cabbage, which is not better food but is a better product. The field pea and the broad bean lost to the haricot. Leaf beet lost to nothing in particular. It drifted out of use. Lovage lost to a stock cube. Cardoon lost to the sheer amount of work it takes. Bistort lost to a shop that stays open all February. One plant on this list was beaten by a better version of the same idea. The other 14 were beaten by a ship, a kiln, a sugar loaf, a seed catalogue, a factory, or a box. Notice who is missing from that ledger. No farmer decided any of this. No agricultural improver wrote a pamphlet against dittander. There is no moment where somebody weighed the pepperwort against the peppercorn and ruled in favour of the peppercorn because it never came to a vote. What happened is that the price of pepper fell, and one spring a household did not bother replanting a root it had been keeping alive for 4 generations. That is the whole mechanism. Nobody has to kill a plant that has stopped being needed. They only have to not plant it once, and then the bed grows something else. And after 2 more springs, nobody in the house has ever seen it. And the people making that decision were mostly not the ones who show up in the records. A manor had a gardener with a name and a wage. Everything else on this list was kept alive in cottage plots and monastic beds by women and children whose work was never written down at all, which is why the disappearance of these 15 has almost no paper trail. There is no record of them going because there was no record of them being there in the first place. That is worth sitting with. 15 plants held the seasoning, the protein, the greens, the sweetness and the medicine of an entire continent for something like 1,000 years, and the paperwork on their disappearance amounts to their names dropping out of seed lists 1 decade at a time. And this is the part that flatters nobody. Most of the 15 were not nicer to eat than what came after them. Smallage really is unpleasant. Elecampane root is bitter enough that candying it took days of work. Colewort is coarse. The field pea takes a night of soaking and an hour of boiling and still tastes like a dried pea. What that garden lost was never quality. It was independence. 15 problems that used to be solved in a bed beside the door are now solved by a supply chain, and the supply chain does the job better on every measure except one. It is not in your garden, and you cannot walk out in January and cut any of it. The gardener planting his pepper in the 15th century was not being quaint about it. He was doing the only sensible thing on offer, and he would have traded the entire bed for a jar of peppercorns without hesitating for a second. Every one of these 15 is still alive somewhere. Salsify and Cardoon are in specialist seed catalogues. Lovage and Alicoste sit in herb nurseries. Bistort is growing wild in wet meadows across northern England right now, and carlin peas still go on sale in the north of England before Lent. None of it needs rescuing. It only needs somebody to have a reason again. Subscribe for more of what got buried. Which would you put back first? The pepperwort, the Alicoste, or the Cardoon? Until next time, keep digging.